There is a particular kind of silence that doesn't feel like quiet. It feels like listening. I didn't understand the difference until the afternoon I stood on the trail in the Harrow Pines with a topographic map in my left hand, a compass in my right, and the slow, nauseating realization spreading through my chest that neither one of them was telling me the truth anymore. Or rather, they were telling me the truth fine. It was the forest that had stopped cooperating with reality. My name is Daniel Voss, and I've been hiking remote wilderness trails for 11 years. I have navigated floodplains in monsoon season. I've camped above the tree line in a whiteout blizzard. I've been genuinely, cartographically lost before, and I know what that feels like. It feels like panic and miscalculation and the slow embarrassment of realizing you turned left where you should have turned right. What happened in the Harrow Pines was not that. What happened in the Harrow Pines was something I have spent 8 months trying to find the language for, and I'm still not certain I have it right. But I'm going to try, because there are people who hike into those woods every season, and most of them don't come back. And the ones who do come back don't usually talk about it. I'm talking about it because staying quiet feels more dangerous than anything that forest can do to me now. The moment the forest path stopped matching my map, I knew I had crossed into something wrong. The trees weren't just moving, they were adjusting around me. That's when I remembered the 7 rules no one tells you about this place, and why breaking even one means you won't make it out. I had heard the rules from an old woman named Petra Haas, who ran a bait and tackle shop at the edge of the Harrow Basin. I had stopped in for water purification tablets the morning I set out, and she had watched me spread my trail map across her counter with the expression of someone watching a child reach for a hot stove. She didn't try to stop me. She just started talking, quietly, like she was reciting something she had memorized long ago and hoped she would never have to say aloud again. 7 rules, she said. 7 rules for if the path stops matching the paper. I wrote them in ballpoint pen on the back of my left hand because I didn't have a notepad close enough to reach, and she was already on Rule 3. I thought she was eccentric. I thought it was local folklore, the kind of cautionary storytelling that small-town people use to keep outsiders from trampling their wilderness. I smiled and thanked her, and hiked into the Harrow Pines at 9 in the morning on a clear October day. By 2 in the afternoon, I was writing those rules in my journal with shaking hands, because every single one of them had started to matter. The first thing that goes wrong is the silence. That's the first symptom, and Petra had named it exactly right. You're walking through a forest that has been full of ordinary noise, birds, insects, the scatter of something small through the undergrowth, and then the noise stops. Not gradually, not the way a forest goes quiet when a predator moves through it, which is a rolling, rippling silence that travels directionally. This silence falls at once, everywhere, simultaneously, like a switch being thrown. The birds don't fly away, the insects don't cease gradually. Everything simply stops, mid-sound, as though the audio track of the world has been cut. When that happens, you are already inside it. The forest has already begun to notice you. I remember standing on the trail when the silence fell and feeling it as a physical pressure against my eardrums. One moment, I could hear a woodpecker working at a dead spruce 40 yards to my east. Then nothing. Not the woodpecker, not the wind in the canopy, not my own footsteps crunching through the frost-stiffened leaf litter. The absence of sound was so complete that my own breathing seemed obscenely loud, and I had the sudden, irrational conviction that I should not be making noise, that whatever had imposed this silence had done so as a kind of expectation, and my breathing was violating it. I looked down at my map. The trail I was standing on, I could feel it clearly beneath my boots, hard-packed and unambiguous, was not where my map said it should be. According to the topographic lines in front of me, I should have been walking along the eastern ridge of a shallow valley, with the elevation dropping gently to my left. Instead, I was on flat ground, dead flat, in a forest where the map showed no flat ground for a kilometer in any direction. I checked my compass. The needle was doing something I had never seen a compass needle do before. It was not spinning, it was not swinging erratically, it was rotating slowly and continuously clockwise, like a second hand on a watch, not searching for north, rotating, as though north had become a concept the needle no longer found relevant. Here is what I know now that I did not know then about what the Harrow Pines actually is. There is a geological and folkloric literature about places like this, scattered across references and surveying records, forestry reports, and the journals of 19th century cartographers who encountered what they called topographic drift in certain remote wilderness areas. The language they used was always careful and reluctant, the language of professional men who knew that what they were writing would compromise their credibility. But the pattern is consistent across decades and continents. There are places where the land is not fixed, where the geography is not a static fact, but something more like a condition, subject to change based on factors that have nothing to do with erosion or plate tectonics. The Harrow Pines is one of those places, and the specific horror of a place like this is that it doesn't just change, it changes in response. The topography breathes, and what it breathes is awareness. The landscape reads you, maps your fear, and reconfigures itself accordingly. Your anxiety about being lost becomes the mechanism by which you become more lost. The more desperately you try to reconcile the terrain with the map, the more aggressively the terrain diverges from it. This is why Rule 1 exists. Trust the paper over the ground. Not because the map is always accurate, but because the map is the only fixed object you have. The map was made before the forest started paying attention to you. The map does not know you are afraid. The map does not want anything from you. The ground does. I didn't fully understand Rule 1 yet, standing on that impossible flat ground with my compass rotating like a clock. I understood it intellectually, Petra had been clear, but there is a profound and nearly irresistible instinct in a trained navigator to trust the terrain over the document. Everything in 11 years of hiking had taught me to read the ground, to let the landscape correct the map when the map was wrong. Unlearning that in real time, under the pressure of the falling silence and the rotating compass needle and the flat ground that should not have been flat, was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, which my watch later told me was closer to 20, just holding the map open and refusing to believe my feet. Then the trees moved. Not fell, not swayed, moved. The spruce trees at the edge of my peripheral vision, maybe 30 feet to my right, shifted. Not dramatically, not cinematically. It was a small, deliberate repositioning, the kind of movement you might make if you were sitting in a chair and decided to angle yourself slightly toward something that had caught your interest. The trees adjusted toward me, and then they were still again, and the silence continued, and I was standing in a forest that had just demonstrated without any ambiguity whatsoever that it knew I was there. I looked at the back of my left hand. The ballpoint ink was slightly smeared from the cold sweat that had broken out across my skin, but the rules were still legible. 7 rules. I had thought they were folklore. I was now holding them like a religious text. Rule 1, trust the paper over the ground. Rule 2, maintain your pace. Do not stop walking. Rule 3, do not look at lights that appear in the trees. Rule 4, never enter a structure that wasn't on the map. Rule 5, do not accept anything offered by something that doesn't speak. Rule 6, watch your shadow. Rule 7, do not look back at the tree line. I started walking. I kept my eyes on the map. I did not look at the trees. And somewhere behind me, in the cathedral silence of the Harrow Pines, something large and patient began to follow. The thing about walking when you don't know where you're going is that every step is an argument with yourself. You are constantly negotiating between what your body tells you and what your mind insists upon. And in a normal forest, that argument is manageable. You feel the slope, you check the map, you triangulate and correct and continue. It's a conversation between the physical world and the documented world, and most of the time they agree on the broad strokes, even when they differ on the details. What was happening in the Harrow Pines was not a disagreement on the details. It was a total philosophical rupture between reality and record, and I was being asked to choose a side. I chose the map. Petra's second rule was more nuanced than it sounded at first. Maintain your pace, she had said, not just as a physical instruction, but as a psychological one. The terrain was doing something specific when it looped or narrowed, she explained. It was reading your gait. A walking person has a rhythm, and that rhythm is tied to confidence, to intentionality, to the specific neurological signature of someone who knows where they are going. A person who slows down because they are uncertain produces a different rhythm, a hesitating, syncopated cadence that the forest interprets as an invitation. Slow down, and the path narrows further. Stop entirely, and the path stops being a path at all. I did not fully understand this until the trail began to loop. It happened gradually, which is the insidious part. The first indication was a fallen log that I stepped over and then, perhaps 10 minutes later, stepped over again. I told myself it was a different log. Fallen timber in a dense forest is not exactly rare. I kept walking. 5 minutes after that, I stepped over it a third time. Same log, same pattern of lichen on its southern face, same broken branch stub at the exact height of my left knee. I had been walking in a straight line, or what felt like a straight line, or what the map suggested should have been a straight line, and I had covered approximately the same fallen log 3 times. This is where most people stop. This is where the instinct to recalibrate overwhelms the instruction to maintain pace, because every trained response you have says that when you recognize you're in a loop, you stop and figure out why before you take another step. Stopping and thinking is the rational response. It is also, in the Harrow Pines, exactly what the forest wants you to do, because the moment you stop moving with purpose, you stop being a navigator and start being prey. And the forest, which has been patiently adjusting itself around your trajectory, closes the loop completely. I did not stop. I gripped the map harder. I kept my eyes on the trail directly in front of my feet, and I walked with the deliberate, metered cadence of someone who is absolutely certain of their destination, even though I was not certain at all. I counted my steps, 1 to 100, then back to 1. It gave my mind something to do other than panic, and it gave my body a rhythm to commit to, something steady enough to hold on to as the trail narrowed around me, and the pines pressed closer on both sides until their lowest branches were brushing my shoulders, and the path ahead was barely the width of my own body. Keep moving. That's all. Just keep moving. The narrowing reached its worst point somewhere around what I estimated to be the 4th hour. The trail had compressed to something barely wider than a deer track, and the trees on either side were so close that I could touch both tree lines simultaneously by extending my arms. The canopy overhead had thickened until the afternoon light was reduced to a gray-green murk, the color of water in an aquarium that hasn't been cleaned in months. My map said I should be approaching the northern ridgeline, where the trail opened into a granite clearing with a good sightline to the valley below. There was no ridgeline. There was no clearing. There was just the narrowing path and the pressing trees and the silence that had not broken for hours. And then the path behind me disappeared. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like a dramatic embellishment, the kind of detail you add to a story to make it more frightening than it was. I am telling you what I saw. I had been keeping periodic glances over my shoulder, partly to monitor my back trail and partly because some animal part of my brain insisted on checking what was behind me, despite my rest of my brain insisting this was a bad idea. On one of these backward glances, I saw the path, clear, hard-packed trail stretching back through the pines the way I had come. On the next glance, perhaps 40 steps later, the trail was gone. Not overgrown, not obscured, gone. Behind me, there was only forest, unbroken and seamless, as though no trail had ever existed, and I had materialized in the middle of the Harrow Pines from nowhere. Rule 2 had a corollary that Petra had mentioned almost as an aside, in the tone of someone noting something too obvious to require emphasis. The path only exists in the direction you are walking. The moment you stop moving forward, it stops existing at all. And now I had visual confirmation that the corollary was not metaphor. I faced forward. I walked. What the forest was doing, and I say this having spent significant time afterward reading everything I could find about places like this, was mapping me back. Every topography has a kind of memory, geographers will tell you, a record of every foot that has ever crossed it, preserved in the compression of soil and the wear pattern of rock. What a sentient landscape does differently is that it doesn't just remember your footprints, it remembers your psychology. It reads the topographic map of your mind, your fears, your fixations, your specific variety of desperation, and it reproduces those features in the physical terrain. My deepest navigational fear, the one I had never fully admitted to myself, was the fear of walking in circles without knowing it, of exerting enormous effort and ending up exactly where I started. The Harrow Pines found that fear within the first hour and spent the rest of the afternoon constructing it around me. The loop was not a feature of the forest. It was a portrait of me. Understanding that did not break the loop, but it changed how I moved through it. Because the moment I recognized that the terrain was a reflection of my psychological state, I understood that the only way to change the terrain was to change the state. Not to feel less afraid. I was not capable of that, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie the forest would have read immediately. But to hold the fear still, to stop letting it move, to carry it the way you carry a full cup, carefully, without spilling, keeping it level even while you walk. I stopped counting steps. I started reciting the map. Out loud, quietly, in a flat and methodical voice, I described every topographic feature on the paper in front of me. The elevation lines, the marked trail intersections, the small creek that should have been to my west and wasn't, the ridge, the clearing. I described them as though they were already beneath my feet, as though the map was not a document of what should be, but a script for what was, and I was reading the world into existence one contour line at a time. I don't know exactly when the trail began to widen. It happened slowly enough that I couldn't identify the precise moment, the way you can't identify the precise moment when it stops being night and starts being morning. But gradually, incrementally, the pines backed away, the path broadened, the canopy thinned. A thin, cold light began to come through the trees from the west, the honest late afternoon light rather than the aquarium murk of before. And then I stepped out onto a granite clearing, and below me, unmistakably, was the valley. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the map, and then at the terrain, and then at the map again. They matched. For the first time in hours, they matched, and the relief of that was so profound and so physical that my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I sat down on the cold granite and breathed, and the wind moved through the trees normally, the way wind moves through trees that are simply trees, and for a few minutes I let myself believe that the worst of it was over. Then I looked up and saw the light moving through the trees below me in the valley. Not sunlight, not the honest late afternoon light that was coming through the canopy above. This light was warm and amber and low to the ground, and it was moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm, back and forth, like a lantern being carried by something that wanted to be seen. I looked down at the back of my hand. Rule 3. Do not look at lights that appear in the trees. I had already looked. There are 3 kinds of light in a dark forest, and knowing the difference between them is the kind of knowledge that feels academic until the moment it becomes the only thing standing between you and something you cannot name. The first kind is biological, foxfire, bioluminescent fungi, the cold blue-green glow of decaying wood. It is diffuse and sourceless, a light that seems to come from the material itself rather than from any concentrated point, and it sits still because the thing producing it sits still. The second kind is atmospheric, ball lightning, swamp gas igniting in low-lying areas, the refraction of moonlight through ice crystals in specific temperature conditions. This light moves, but it moves the way weather moves, without intention, in response to wind and physics and the indifferent choreography of the natural world. The third kind moves like it has somewhere to be, and it wants you to follow. I was sitting on the granite clearing above the valley when I saw it, and the first thing I did wrong was to keep looking. Petra had been specific about this. The rule was not simply be cautious around unusual lights. The rule was non-engagement, total and immediate, eyes down the moment you register that a light source doesn't belong to the first 2 categories. The reason for this, she had explained in her quiet, factual way, is that the phantom lantern doesn't capture you through physical means. It captures you through attention. The moment you give it your eyes, it has already begun to work. The gaze is the mechanism. Looking is the first step of following, and following is the last thing you will ever do. I had already looked, which meant I had maybe 90 seconds to implement the countermeasure before the looking became something I couldn't stop. The countermeasure was specific and felt absolutely ridiculous. Fix your eyes on the ground and find something to describe in detail. Not to think about, not to visualize, to describe in language, either aloud or in writing, because language activates a different cognitive process than visual tracking, and the lantern's pull is purely visual, a hook in the optic nerve rather than the conscious mind. If you occupy the part of your brain that processes visual information with the act of generating verbal description of something directly in front of you, the hook finds nothing to catch on to. I looked at the granite between my boots. I started describing it. The stone is gray with a slight pink mineral inclusion running northeast to southwest, feldspar probably, and the surface is rough at the macro scale, but the individual crystals are small, fine-grained, the kind of granite that forms slowly deep underground rather than at the surface. And there is a lichen colony on the eastern face of the nearest outcrop, gray-green, circular, probably 50 years old given the diameter, and the frost has settled into the low points of the rock face where the wind doesn't reach, thin white crystals along the edges of the crystal boundaries in the stone. The amber light in the valley below intensified. I felt it as warmth on the top of my head, which should have been impossible given that the source was 300 feet below me and separated by a canopy of spruce. The warmth was not meteorological, it was personal. It felt like being noticed, the specific sensation of someone across a room turning to look at you before you've looked at them, that prickling awareness of focused attention from an external source. The lantern was not just moving, the lantern was looking back. I kept describing the granite. I did not look up. The hum started about a minute into my description, which is how I knew it was a genuine phantom lantern and not some hiker with a camping lamp in the valley below. Petra had described the hum specifically, not a sound exactly, more a frequency, something felt in the sinus cavities and behind the eyes rather than heard through the ears. A resonance, she said, like a tuning fork pressed against the skull. The frequency that signals what she called a collapse in the distance between here and elsewhere, which I had not understood when she said it, and understood entirely now, because I could feel the distance collapsing around me. The valley below, which was 300 feet down a granite slope, was somehow becoming adjacent. The space between me and the lantern was folding, the way you fold paper to bring 2 points that were far apart into contact. And if I looked up, the fold would complete, and I would be where the lantern was, and the lantern would be wherever it had intended to take me. I stood up. I kept my eyes down. I turned 90 degrees away from the valley. I could feel which direction it was, the way you can feel a fire to your back even when you're not looking at it. And I started walking along the ridgeline with my eyes fixed on the ground directly ahead of my feet. The hum followed me for approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes of walking a ridgeline in near darkness with a frequency resonating behind my eyes and the amber warmth pressing against the back of my head like a hand. 40 minutes of describing, in a quiet, constant murmur, everything my downcast eyes found in front of me. Frost, granite, spruce root, granite, dead leaf, brown, likely red maple based on the lobe structure, spruce root, granite, frost, granite. The hum stopped between one step and the next, the same way the silence had fallen hours before, completely, instantly, with no transition. I stood still for a moment, testing the absence. The warmth on the back of my head was gone. The folding sensation, the collapsing distance was gone. I looked up, cautiously, by degrees, the way you look toward a bright light after a long darkness, waiting for the pain. The valley below was dark. The lantern was gone. I leaned against a spruce tree and let myself shake for a while because I had been holding the shaking at bay for hours and my body needed somewhere to put it. The cold had deepened while I walked. The light in the west was gone now, just a residual orange bruise above the tree line where the sun had been, and above that, stars, real stars, honest and fixed in their constellations, the genuine North Star sitting exactly where my compass should have been pointing. I looked at my compass. The needle had stopped rotating. It was pointing north again, steady and certain, as though the last 6 hours hadn't happened. I checked my map. According to my current position and the remaining daylight, there wasn't any. I was at least 4 hours from the trailhead, and that assumed the trail continued to behave like a trail. My original plan had been to reach the valley campsite before dark. That option was now several categories of impossible, which meant I needed shelter. I pulled out my bivouac kit, checked my position on the map one more time, and began looking for the natural rock shelter that the topographic markings suggested should be approximately 200 meters to my north along the ridge. The rock shelter was there. That was the first surprise. The second surprise was the cabin next to it. The cabin was small and dark, maybe 4 meters by 6, built from the local spruce with the bark still on the logs. No light in the window, no smoke from the chimney, no indication of occupation. My map, which had been produced from an aerial survey 8 years ago and updated twice since, showed this area as uninhabited wilderness. There was no structure marker anywhere near this position. I stood at the edge of the rock shelter and looked at the cabin and felt every rule I had written on my hand simultaneously contract around my attention. Rule 4, never enter a structure that wasn't on the map. But there was something else, something that pulled against Rule 4 with a force I had not anticipated and had no defenses prepared for. The smell of food. From inside the dark, supposedly empty cabin came the warm and unmistakable smell of something cooking, wood smoke and something savory, the smell of a meal prepared by someone who knew what they were doing, the smell of warmth and nourishment, and the specific comfort of human presence after hours of walking alone through a forest that was trying to unmake me. My body responded to that smell before my mind could intervene. My mouth flooded with saliva. My legs took 2 steps toward the cabin door before I felt the movement and stopped it. I stood in the cold and looked at the dark cabin and smelled the food that should not have existed. And the door opened. There was a figure in the doorway. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because figure is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and I owe you the specifics. It was human-shaped, the right height, the right proportions, the posture of a person standing in a doorway rather than the posture of something wearing a person's shape as a costume. It stood there in the rectangle of warmth that spilled from the open door, backlit by the interior light that I could not explain given that the cabin had showed no light from the outside, and it did not move, did not gesture, did not speak. It simply stood, and the door was open, and the smell of food was stronger now, and the warmth reached me from 20 feet away like a physical invitation. I counted to 10. Standard protocol when your body wants to do something your mind knows is wrong. 1 through 10, slow and deliberate, watching the figure. The figure watched back. In 10 seconds of observation, I cataloged everything I could. The face was in shadow because the light was behind it, which was either coincidence or design. The hands were at its sides, still, no object in either hand. The feet were not quite touching the threshold. It was standing just inside the doorway, with both feet on the interior floor, not crossing out. This detail lodged in my mind and refused to move. The cabin appeared on no map. The structure was impossible. The figure did not speak, but it had not crossed the threshold. It was waiting, not beckoning. The difference felt significant in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Petra's fifth rule was about the specific danger of mimicry. The entities she described, and she used the word entities without embarrassment, with the flat, factual tone of a woman reporting observable phenomena, were not capable of original communication. They could reproduce sounds, gestures, expressions they had recorded from previous encounters, but they could not generate novel speech, because novel speech requires a kind of interior life they do not possess. They experienced the world as surface, shapes, sounds, patterns, temperatures. They could copy any of these things with extraordinary fidelity. What they could not do was respond to something they had never encountered, something that required genuine understanding rather than sophisticated mimicry. Petra's fifth rule was about the specific danger of mimicry. The entities she described, and she used the word entities without embarrassment, with the flat, factual tone of a woman reporting observable phenomena, were not capable of original communication. They could reproduce sounds, gestures, expressions they had recorded from previous encounters, but they could not generate novel speech, because novel speech requires a kind of interior life they do not possess. They experienced the world as surface, shapes, sounds, patterns, temperatures. They could copy any of these things with extraordinary fidelity. What they could not do was respond to something they had never encountered, something that required genuine understanding rather than sophisticated mimicry. Petra's suggested test was specific, and I had memorized it without knowing I was memorizing it, the way you memorize things that are told to you in a tone of absolute seriousness. Ask a specific contextual question, not "Who are you?" or "What do you want?" Those have recorded answers. Something narrow, something that required genuine comprehension of your specific present circumstances to answer correctly. I called out across the 20 feet of cold air. I came from the eastern ridge. How long ago did the North Trail loop close? The figure was still. I waited. The figure raised its right hand slowly. Not in a wave, not in a gesture of beckoning, in the posture of someone about to speak, the way a person raises a hand when they're about to say something and want to signal that they're about to say it. The posture was perfect. The timing was perfect. The pause before speaking was exactly right. Exactly the pause a person makes when they're gathering a response to a specific question. Then it made a sound that was not speech. It was the shape of speech, the music of a sentence, the cadence of an answer delivered in a helpful tone. The syllables were approximately right. The sentence length was plausible, but there were no words inside it. It was language processed through something that understood language as pure sound rather than meaning, a recording played back without comprehension of what had been recorded. I took out the iron camp knife I had in my right hip pocket, the one I always carried for practical reasons and which had become relevant for entirely different reasons the moment Petra mentioned iron. Rule 5's defense was not designed to stop an attack. It was designed to establish a perimeter, a boundary of material that the entity recognized as hostile to its specific mode of existence. Iron and salt both worked, she said, not because of magic, but because of chemistry. The compounds they disrupted in the soil and air around them were compounds the entity required for its physical coherence, the same way certain bacteria require specific pH ranges to survive. The iron didn't hurt it. It just told it that the space around you was inhospitable, like a chemical fence rather than a physical one. I pulled the iron knife. The figure in the doorway flinched. That was the word for it. A small involuntary retraction, a millimeter of withdrawal from the threshold, the way you flinch from something bright or loud. Then it recovered and stood still again, but I had seen the flinch, and the flinch told me everything I needed to know about what I was looking at. I didn't have salt in a useful form. I had a few foil seasoning packets in my pack, the kind that come with instant noodles, and I was not confident they contained enough sodium chloride to do what needed doing. But I had the iron knife, and I had the knowledge of what the flinch meant, and I had the very clear understanding that I was not getting closer to that cabin under any circumstances. What I needed was to leave. The problem was that leaving required walking back into the forest in the dark, with no light source I was willing to trust, and a compass that had spent the last several hours having an existential crisis. I had my headlamp, reliable LED, but using artificial light in the Harrow Pines at night was something Petra had not addressed directly, which I interpreted as either oversight or the assumption that no one would be foolish enough to be in these woods after dark. I turned on the headlamp on its lowest setting and kept the beam directed at the ground directly in front of my feet. The figure in the cabin doorway was still there when I glanced back. And I know, Rule 7 says don't look back, but Rule 7 is specifically about the pine line at the end, not about looking back while still inside. And I needed to track the entity's behavior as I withdrew. Still there, not following, not speaking, watching, with whatever it used for eyes in that face I still hadn't clearly seen, with a patience that felt geological, the patience of something that has waited before and is entirely prepared to wait again. I walked north along the ridge, slowly, iron knife in my right hand, headlamp beam on the ground, map in my left hand, even though the dark made reading it nearly impossible. I gave myself a direction and committed to it, because the forest feeds on uncertainty, and I could not afford to broadcast any more of it than my body was already producing involuntarily. Behind me, after perhaps 3 minutes, I heard the cabin door close, softly. The sound of a door closed by someone who knows how to manage a latch, the precise domestic sound of a quiet household settling for the night. I did not look back. I kept walking. The night deepened around me. The stars above the canopy were my only navigation, North Stars steady and honest through the breaks in the trees, and I used it the way sailors used it for 10,000 years before GPS made that knowledge relevant, simple, ancient, impossible to corrupt. The forest could adjust its topography and loop its trails and move its trees and populate its clearings with impossible structures and the things that lived inside them. It could not move the stars. I walked by starlight and headlamp and iron for what my watch said was 3 hours. The forest stayed quiet, but it was a different quiet now, less the switched-off silence of concentrated attention and more the ordinary quiet of a cold night in deep woods, the kind of quiet that has insects in it, and the distant call of an owl, and the movement of small things through dead leaves. Then I noticed my shadow. The headlamp cast my shadow ahead of me on the ground, long and thin, the stretched shadow of a person walking with a light source behind them. That was correct and expected. What was not correct and not expected was what the shadow was doing. It was walking at a slightly different pace than I was. I stopped. My shadow did not stop at the same moment I did. It continued forward for one additional step, then stopped. I took 2 quick steps forward, my shadow took 2 steps forward, and then, with a beat of delay that was entirely distinct from any optical illusion, any trick of a moving light source, any rational explanation I could construct, it took one more. Rule 6. Watch your shadow. I had been watching my shadow for hours, checking it periodically the way you check your mirrors while driving, and until this moment it had behaved like a shadow. Now it was doing something a shadow should not be able to do, and the specific thing it was doing, moving at a different cadence than my footsteps, was precisely what Petra had described as the final warning, the last indication you receive before the forest completes its process of claiming you entirely. The shadow detaching from your body's rhythm means the landscape has begun to imprint on your physical presence, to produce a map of you as thoroughly as you have been trying to produce a map of it. When the shadow fully detaches, when it begins to move independently rather than just differently, you are no longer a visitor in the forest. You are terrain. You are a feature. You stay. I had maybe 20 minutes before the detachment completed. The technique for breaking the loop was the 7th rule's practical application, and Petra had called it the blind walk, which was exactly as terrifying as it sounded. The principle was simple, and the execution was nearly impossible. For the final stretch of the exit, you put away every navigational tool, every map, every compass, every GPS, and you walk by feel alone in the direction that makes you most afraid, because the forest maps itself to your fears, and the exit is always on the other side of the thing that frightens you most. The loop exists because you keep navigating away from fear, because every trained instinct you have is telling you to go toward the easier ground, the familiar landmark, the safe choice. And every time you do that, you are following a trail the forest has laid specifically for you, a trail that curves back on itself and ends where it began. To break the loop, you walk toward the fear. I put my map in my pack. I turned off my headlamp. I took my compass out once more to register north, and then I put it in my pack too. I stood in the complete darkness of the Harrow Pines, with my shadow moving at its slightly wrong cadence on the ground that I could no longer see, and I asked myself with total seriousness what direction most frightened me. The cabin was to my south. I could still smell it faintly, the food smell, the warmth smell. That was one kind of fear. The valley where the phantom lantern had been was to my southwest, and that was another kind. But the direction that produced the truest, coldest, least reasoned fear was northeast, which was deeper into the forest, which was the direction I had been navigating away from for hours, because my map showed that the forest continued northeast for 12 kilometers before reaching any road or structure, and 12 kilometers of this forest in the dark with no navigation, with a shadow that was trying to separate from my body, was a proposal so objectively terrible that my entire nervous system was mounting a simultaneous protest against it. Northeast, then. I walked into the dark with my hands out in front of me, my eyes open and entirely useless, my feet finding the ground by feel and weight. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth in a deliberate 4-4-4 rhythm, because if the landscape was reading my psychological state, I was going to give it something steady to read. I was going to present the topography of a person who was afraid and walking anyway, which is not bravery and is not fearlessness, but is a specific kind of functional resolution that is worth more than either. The dark forest was full of sound now. This surprised me. The hours of silence had made me think of the Harrow Pines as essentially quiet, but in the full dark, blind and navigating by feel, the sound came back. Wind in the canopy, something moving through the undergrowth to my right, a creak of a tree and a wind I couldn't yet feel at ground level. Ordinary sounds, every one of them. The sound of a forest that was not listening anymore, a forest engaged in its own business, indifferent to the person walking through it in the dark. My shadow, I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The way you feel a presence behind you before you turn and verify it. It was still with me, still attached to my heels, still moving, but moving at my pace now. The delay diminished, shortened, closing. Each step I took northeast was a step toward the thing I was most afraid of, which was also a step away from the thing that the forest wanted me to do. And the forest expressed its disapproval in the way the forest always expressed things, through the terrain. The ground rose sharply under my feet where the map had shown it rising gradually. Tree roots snagged my ankles. A low branch caught me across the forehead hard enough to draw blood, and the blood ran warm down the bridge of my nose, and I wiped it away and kept walking. 40 minutes into the blind walk, I stepped on a surface that sounded different. Not dirt, not granite, something compressed and uniform under my feet, the specific sound of gravel. I stopped and crouched and felt the ground with my hands. Gravel, small, rounded, deliberately laid, not natural, constructed. I stood up and turned on my headlamp. I was standing on a gravel fire road, single lane, overgrown at the edges, but maintained. The gravel was recently topped. The drainage channels on either side were clear. A fire road means a gate, and a gate means a trailhead. And a trailhead means a parking area and a road means out. I looked at my shadow in the headlamp beam. It stopped when I stopped. It moved when I moved. Perfect cadence, perfect synchrony. My shadow was mine again. I turned off the headlamp and stood in the dark for a moment, just breathing, just being a person in a forest on a gravel road, with the smell of frost and spruce around me, and the stars overhead, and nothing else, just the ordinary night, just the forest being a forest. Then I turned the headlamp back on and started following the fire road in the direction the drainage slope suggested was downhill. I reached the gate 40 minutes later. I reached the paved road 5 minutes after that. I reached my truck parked at the original trailhead just before 4 in the morning, 9 hours and change after I had entered the Harrow Pines on a clear October afternoon. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. The blood on my face had dried to a thin crust. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere on the fire road. I looked at the back of my left hand, where the 7 rules were still faintly legible in ballpoint ink, smeared by hours of cold sweat. Then I looked at the tree line. I couldn't help it. 11 years of trail instinct, 11 years of looking back at the way you came, turned my head toward the dark edge of the Harrow Pines before I had finished deciding to do it. Rule 7. Do not look back at the pine line. There was nothing there, just trees. Just the dark edge of the forest against the pre-dawn sky, just the silhouette of spruce against stars, the way a forest looks at 4 in the morning when you're sitting in a truck in a parking lot and you've just had the worst night of your life. There was nothing in the trees. There was nothing at the tree line. I looked for a full 30 seconds and there was nothing there. And the relief of that was immense and genuine. And then the thing at the tree line turned its head. I don't know what I saw. I know how I felt seeing it. It had been standing still enough for long enough that I had processed it as part of the tree line itself, as a shadow among shadows, as the natural geometry of pine branches against the sky. And then it moved, just the head, just the slow, deliberate rotation of something that had been watching me since I pulled into the lot, or since I stepped out of the trees, or since I made the mistake of looking back when the seventh rule told me not to look back. Whatever it was, it turned its head, and for one moment we were looking at each other across the 40 feet of gravel parking lot, and then it was still again, and then it was gone, and I could not tell you whether it had moved back into the trees or had simply ceased to be visible, because those might be the same thing. I started my truck. I drove 4 hours to the nearest town without stopping. I checked into a motel and slept for 16 hours and woke up with frost on the inside of the window, which should not happen in a heated room, and I chose not to think about what that meant. I went back to Petra's shop 3 weeks later. I needed her to know that the rules had worked. I needed her to know that someone had made it out. The shop was still there, same bait bins, same hand-lettered signs in a window, same bell above the door. But the woman behind the counter was someone I had never seen, a young man, early 20s, who told me Petra Haas had retired 2 years ago and moved away, he didn't know where. 2 years ago, before I visited the shop, before she recited the rules to me over my open map, before I thanked her and drove toward the Harrow Pines on a clear October morning. I stood in her shop for a long time holding the water purification tablets I didn't need anymore. Then I took out a ballpoint pen and wrote the 7 rules on the back of a paper receipt from the counter. I left it under the pen holder next to the register, where the next person spreading out a trail map might find it. It's the most I can do. It has to be enough.